In the year 877, something unusual happened in medieval Spain. The Muslim emir of Córdoba sent ambassadors to the Christian king of Asturias, Alfonso III, to negotiate a 3-year peace treaty. The two rulers had just spent months trying to kill each other's armies, and now they were shaking hands. Here's what's strange about this. According to most popular histories, the Reconquista was 7 centuries of relentless holy war. Christians versus Muslims, cross versus crescent. An endless crusade to reclaim Spain. But if that's true, why were they signing peace treaties, and not just once, repeatedly, throughout those 7 centuries? The reality is far more interesting than the legend. For most of the Reconquista, nobody was actually reconquering anything. Christians and Muslims weren't locked in perpetual combat. They were trading with each other, making alliances, sometimes fighting side by side against their own co-religionists, and in many cases, just living next to each other, buying bread from the same markets. The holy war narrative makes for great drama. But it hides a fascinating truth about medieval Iberia. This was one of the most culturally complex, economically interconnected regions in medieval Europe. And the border between Christian and Muslim territories wasn't really a border at all. It was more like a permeable membrane where people, goods, and ideas flowed in both directions. In this video, we'll explore what life was actually like in medieval Spain, when the swords were sheathed. You'll discover how Christians thrived under Muslim rule, why thousands of Iberians voluntarily converted to Islam, how tribute payments created economic partnerships that nobody wanted to break, and why Christian and Muslim lords often had more in common with each other than with their own peasants. We'll also see how this period of exchange gave us some of the most important cultural achievements of the Middle Ages, from architectural innovations to agricultural techniques that changed Europe forever. The story of the Reconquista you haven't heard starts here, not on the battlefield, but in the market square. Not with warriors, but with merchants, farmers, and scholars who lived in a world far more nuanced than we've been led to believe. To understand this, we need to start at the beginning. Right after the conquest, when the Muslims won the war, but realized they needed to win the peace. After the Muslim conquest of Iberia between 711 and 714, the Umayyad commanders faced an interesting problem. They had just conquered an enormous territory with a tiny army. Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the strait with maybe 7,000 troops. Even after reinforcements arrived under Musa ibn Nusayr, the entire Muslim force probably numbered less than 25,000 men, and they had just taken control of a peninsula with an estimated population of 4 to 7 million people. Do the math. That's roughly 1 Muslim soldier for every 200 inhabitants. You can't occupy a country with those numbers. You can barely guard the major cities. So the Umayyads did something pragmatic. They didn't try to convert everyone. They didn't impose Islamic law on the entire population. They didn't even replace most local officials. Instead, they created a system that allowed the conquered population to keep living mostly as they had before, as long as they paid taxes and didn't rebel. This wasn't unique to Spain. It was standard Umayyad practice throughout their empire. The Quran actually provided for this. Christians and Jews were people of the book, protected minorities who could practice their faith in exchange for a special tax called the jizya. In practical terms, this meant that the vast majority of Iberians woke up after the conquest and found their lives hadn't changed that much. If you were a Christian farmer in 710, you paid taxes to a Visigothic lord. In 715, you paid taxes to a Muslim governor. The amount might be different, but the principle was the same. You worked the land. Someone else took a cut. The Umayyads were even smart enough to keep many existing administrative structures. Visigothic nobles who submitted to Muslim rule often kept their lands and titles. They just had a new overlord in Córdoba instead of Toledo. Some of these nobles even converted to Islam, not necessarily out of religious conviction, but because it was good career advancement. This pragmatic approach explains something that puzzles many people. Why didn't the Iberians immediately rise up and throw out the invaders? Because for many of them, especially the lower classes, the conquest wasn't the catastrophe we might imagine. Under the Visigoths, the tax burden had been crushing, the legal system favored the nobility, and religious persecution of Jews was common. The Umayyads, by contrast, were relatively light-handed in their early governance. Of course, not everyone was happy. That's why Pelagius and his followers retreated to the mountains of Asturias and started what we now call the Reconquista. But they were a minority. Most Iberians chose accommodation over resistance. This decision to accommodate rather than resist created the foundation for everything that came after. It established a pattern of coexistence that would define Iberian society for centuries, and it meant that from the very beginning, the line between Christian Spain and Muslim Spain was blurry at best. The conquest created two overlapping populations living in the same territory. The Muslims called Christians under their rule mozarabs, which comes from the Arabic mustarib, meaning Arabized. These were Christians who adopted Arabic language and customs while keeping their faith. And then there were the muladis, Iberian Christians who converted to Islam. By some estimates, within 2 centuries of the conquest, the majority of the population in Al-Andalus had converted, not through force, but through a combination of economic incentives, social pressure, and genuine religious conviction. These weren't abstract categories. They were real people making practical decisions about how to live in a changing world. And their stories revealed just how complicated medieval Iberia actually was. Let's talk about the mozarabs first, because their experience challenges almost everything we think we know about religious minorities in the Middle Ages. Imagine you're a Christian living in Cordoba in the year 850. You wake up in your house in the Christian quarter. You speak Arabic at home, because that's the language of commerce and government. Your children are learning Arabic poetry in school, alongside the Quran, though they're still being raised Christian. You walk to your job at the central market. You're a merchant, selling olive oil produced on lands your family has owned for generations. Your best customer is a Muslim official who pays well and on time. Your biggest competitor is another Christian, not a Muslim. On Sunday, you attend Mass at the Church of St. Asisclus. The service is in Latin, but the priest's sermon references Arabic philosophical concepts you all understand. After church, you stop by the workshop of a Muslim craftsman to pick up a custom leather saddle you ordered. In the evening, you host a dinner party. Your guests include Muslim neighbors, Jewish traders, and fellow Christians. You serve wine, which your Muslim guests politely decline, but everyone enjoys the meal and the conversation flows easily between Arabic, Latin, and bits of Hebrew. This was real life for thousands of mozarabs. They weren't hiding their Christianity or living in fear. They were integrated into Muslim society while maintaining their distinct identity. The legal framework made this possible. Under Islamic law, Christians paid the jizya tax and in return received protection and the right to practice their religion. They couldn't build new churches without permission, but they could maintain existing ones. They couldn't proselytize to Muslims, but they could raise their children Christian. Were there restrictions? Absolutely. Christians couldn't hold the highest government offices. They had to dress slightly differently to be identifiable. In court, a Christian's testimony was worth less than a Muslim's. These were real disadvantages. But compared to how religious minorities were treated in Christian Europe at the same time, it was remarkably tolerant. In Frankish territories, Jews faced severe persecution. Heretics were burned. The idea of a Christian church operating openly in a Muslim capital would have been as foreign as a mosque operating openly in Rome. The mozarabs even developed their own distinct culture. They created a unique liturgical tradition, different from Roman Catholicism, that survived until the 11th century. They produced literature in Arabic, including translations of scientific and philosophical works that would later be crucial to the European Renaissance. Some mozarabs became wealthy and influential. We have records of Christian merchants who dominated certain trade routes, Christian physicians who treated Muslim patients, Christian administrators who served in the Umayyad bureaucracy. Of course, not everything was peaceful coexistence. In the 850s, a group of radical Christians in Córdoba began deliberately provoking martyrdom, publicly insulting Islam to force the authorities to execute them. This Martyrs of Córdoba movement created significant tension. But here's the interesting part. Most mozarabs opposed these martyrs. They saw them as troublemakers disrupting a workable arrangement. The mozarab experience shows that religious coexistence in the Middle Ages was possible, practical, and in many cases preferable to constant conflict. It wasn't utopia, but it worked well enough that Christian communities in Al-Andalus thrived for centuries. Now let's look at the other side, the muladis, Iberians who converted to Islam. Their story is just as revealing. Why would a Christian convert to Islam in medieval Spain? The most obvious answer is economic. Muslims didn't pay the jizya. They had access to better jobs, especially in government. They could testify in court on equal terms. For an ambitious person, conversion opened doors. But it wasn't just about money. Many conversions were genuine religious choices. Islam was the religion of the ruling class, the language of high culture, the faith associated with a sophisticated urban civilization. For a rural Iberian peasant, Islam might have seemed more advanced, more connected to the wider world than Christianity. Family dynamics also played a role. Intermarriage was common. A Christian woman who married a Muslim man would often convert. The children of such marriages were raised Muslim. Over generations, entire family lines transitioned from Christianity to Islam. The most famous muladis were the Banu Qasi, a powerful dynasty we mentioned earlier. They were descended from Visigothic nobility who converted in the early 8th century. By the 9th century, they controlled much of the Upper March, the frontier territory in northeastern Spain. Here's what's fascinating. The Banu Qasi fought sometimes against Christians, sometimes against other Muslims, and sometimes alongside Christians against Muslims. Their primary loyalty wasn't to Islam or to the Umayyad Emirate. It was to their own family interests and territorial control. In 842, the Banu Qasi allied with the Christian kingdom of Pamplona against the Emir of Córdoba. In 860, they switched sides and fought against Pamplona alongside Córdoba. Then in 882, they rebelled against Córdoba again. This wasn't unusual behavior. It was typical frontier politics. Religion mattered, but it wasn't the only thing that mattered. Maybe not even the most important thing. The existence of the muladis reveals something crucial. The Reconquista wasn't a simple story of native Iberians fighting against foreign Muslim invaders. Many of the Muslims were native Iberians, and some of the fiercest defenders of Al-Andalus were the descendants of Visigothic Christians. The religious and ethnic lines weren't clean. They never are in real history. If you're finding this interesting, drop a like to help the channel. Takes a second and makes a difference. Now, let's talk about how money connected these worlds even more than religion divided them. In the year 920, Ordoño II, the Christian king of Leon, had a problem. His kingdom was relatively poor. The land was good for farming, but not wealthy. He needed money to pay soldiers, build fortifications, and maintain his court. Meanwhile, in Córdoba, Abd al-Rahman III ruled over one of the richest territories in Europe. Al-Andalus had thriving cities, sophisticated industries, and control of lucrative trade routes connecting Europe to Africa and the Middle East. So Ordoño and Abd al-Rahman made a deal. Leon would pay an annual tribute called parias to Córdoba. In exchange, Córdoba would leave Leon alone and provide military support against Ordoño's rivals. Wait, what? The Christian king paid the Muslim emir to not attack him? Yes. And this wasn't some humiliating submission. It was a standard political arrangement. Think of it as buying peace and an alliance at the same time. The tribute system was central to Iberian politics for centuries. It wasn't always Christians paying Muslims either. Sometimes Muslims paid Christians. Sometimes Christian kingdoms paid other Christian kingdoms. Sometimes Muslim taifas paid other Muslim taifas. The logic was simple. War is expensive and unpredictable. Tribute is predictable and cheaper than maintaining a standing army. If you can pay your neighbor to not invade, and maybe even to help you fight your other neighbor, that's just good business. Let's look at how this actually worked. A Christian kingdom like Leon might pay 10,000 gold dinars annually to Córdoba. That sounds like a lot. But consider, the alternative, maintaining a large enough army to defend against Córdoba would cost far more. Plus, the tribute bought you more than just peace. It bought you a diplomatic relationship. Once you're paying tribute, you have leverage. You can negotiate. You can ask for help against third parties. You can establish trade agreements. The tributary relationship created channels of communication that could be used for all sorts of purposes. And here's the thing. The money flowed. But so did everything else. Merchants followed the tribute payments. When a Leon official traveled to Córdoba to deliver the annual tribute, he didn't just hand over a bag of gold and leave. He stayed for weeks. He met with officials. He observed Córdoban society. He bought goods to bring back home. These tributary missions were essentially trade delegations. Christian kingdoms imported luxury goods from Al-Andalus, silk textiles, metalwork, ceramics, books, spices. In return, they exported raw materials, wool, leather, timber, metals from northern mines. The trade created economic interdependence. A Christian noble in Leon might wear silk robes made in Córdoba. A Muslim official in Córdoba might use leather goods made in Castile. Their economies were interlocked. This explains something that puzzles people about the Reconquista. Why did it take so long? 7 centuries seems like an awfully long time for a reconquest. But the answer is simple. For long stretches, nobody was trying very hard to reconquer anything. The existing arrangement worked fine. The tribute system also created strange political situations. In the 11th century, after the Umayyad Caliphate collapsed and Al-Andalus broke into small kingdoms called taifas, the Christian kingdoms became the dominant military powers. But instead of conquering the taifas, they preferred to extract tribute from them. El Cid, the famous Christian knight, actually spent years in Muslim service. He fought for the Taifa of Zaragoza against Christian and Muslim enemies alike. Why? Because the Muslim ruler paid better than the Christian king. This wasn't considered treasonous or heretical. It was considered normal. Military service was a profession. You fought for whoever hired you. Religion was one factor in choosing employers, but not the only factor. The economic connections went beyond tribute and trade. There was also significant technological exchange. Muslims introduced new irrigation techniques to Iberia, allowing previously marginal lands to become highly productive. They brought new crops, rice, sugarcane, citrus fruits, eggplants. These agricultural innovations transformed the Iberian landscape and economy. Christians adopted these techniques rapidly. By the 10th century, Christian kingdoms in the north were using Muslim irrigation methods and growing Muslim-introduced crops. Farmers don't care about the religion of a good idea. They care whether it increases their harvest. The irrigation systems in particular created lasting bonds. Many irrigation networks crossed political boundaries. You can't maintain a complex canal system if you're constantly at war with the people upstream. So communities that shared water sources had a built-in incentive to maintain peaceful relations, regardless of religion. Money is a powerful peacemaker. And in medieval Iberia, the economic incentives for coexistence were often stronger than the religious incentives for conflict. Let's talk about the alliances that really show how complicated medieval Iberia was. Because nothing reveals the complexity better than watching Christian and Muslim armies fight side by side. In 1063, a Christian army besieged the Muslim city of Barbastro in northeastern Spain. But this wasn't a Reconquista battle. The Christian army was actually there to help the Muslim ruler of Zaragoza against a rival Muslim kingdom. They were joined by Muslim troops from Zaragoza fighting against fellow Muslims from Barbastro. Or consider this. In 1086, the Christian king Alfonso VI of Castile had just conquered the important Muslim city of Toledo. The remaining Muslim taifas were terrified, so they called for help from the Almoravids, a fundamentalist Berber dynasty from North Africa. The Almoravids arrived, defeated Alfonso's army at Sagrayas, and then the taifa rulers realized they'd made a terrible mistake. The Almoravids were religious zealots who disapproved of the tolerant, culturally mixed society in Al-Andalus. Within a few years, the Almoravids had conquered the taifas themselves, replacing the relatively relaxed Muslim rulers with hardliners. Alfonso VI, the Christian king who had been fighting these taifa rulers for years, suddenly found himself on the same side as his former Muslim enemies. Both Christian and Muslim Iberians now faced a common threat from fundamentalist invaders. This pattern repeated throughout the Reconquista. The fault lines weren't primarily religious. They were political, territorial, and personal. Religion mattered, but so did many other things. Take the relationship between the Christian kingdom of Castile and the Muslim taifa of Toledo in the mid-11th century. The two states had a tributary relationship, with Toledo paying Castile for protection, but it went deeper than that. The rulers genuinely seemed to respect each other. When Al-Mamun, the Muslim king of Toledo, faced rebellion from his own son, the Christian king of Castile, Ferdinand I, sent troops to help Al-Mamun crush the rebellion. Christian soldiers fighting to keep a Muslim king in power against his own son. That's not supposed to happen in a religious war. The Banu Qasi dynasty, which we mentioned earlier, exemplifies this pattern. Musa ibn Musa, who ruled in the 9th century, was known as the third king of Spain because he was so powerful. He was Muslim. His lands bordered the Christian kingdoms of Pamplona and Asturias, and he was married to a Christian princess, not a converted princess, an actual Christian princess who remained Christian. His children were raised Muslim, but they had a Christian mother and Christian relatives in the northern kingdoms. When those kingdoms faced threats from other Muslims, Musa sometimes helped them. When he faced threats from Christian kingdoms, sometimes other Christians helped him. These weren't betrayals. This was normal politics. Medieval rulers understood that the enemy of my enemy is my friend transcended religious boundaries. We're getting to the most interesting part. If you're not subscribed yet, this is a good time. There's new content here every week. Now let's see what all this mixing produced culturally. In the year 930, a Christian monk from northern Spain traveled to Cordoba. His name was Recommend, and he was there as an ambassador from the Kingdom of Leon. While in Cordoba, he was stunned by what he saw. The city had over 100,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest cities in Europe. The streets were paved and lit at night with oil lamps. There were public baths, libraries, and running water. The great mosque was an architectural marvel with hundreds of columns and arches of alternating red and white stone. Recommend returned north with more than diplomatic agreements. He brought books, ideas, and a new understanding of what was possible. He had seen a sophisticated urban civilization, and it changed him. This was happening constantly. Every diplomatic mission, every merchant journey, every visit by a Christian scholar to Muslim lands was an opportunity for cultural exchange, and the exchange went both ways. Let's start with architecture. The most visible legacy of Christian-Muslim interaction is in the buildings. The Great Mosque of Cordoba, built in the 8th century and expanded several times, incorporated elements from Roman, Visigothic, and Islamic traditions. The famous red and white arches were inspired by the Roman aqueduct in Merida. When Christians began building in the Romanesque style in the 11th and 12th centuries, they borrowed extensively from Islamic architecture. The use of horseshoe arches, geometric patterns, and elaborate stone carving in churches throughout northern Spain shows clear Islamic influence. The Church of San Baudelio in Castile, built in the early 11th century, has a central column with radiating arches that looks remarkably similar to structures in Al-Andalus. The church's palm tree-like column was clearly inspired by Muslim architectural motifs. This wasn't unconscious copying. Christian and Muslim architects worked together. After the conquest of Toledo in 1085, Alfonso VI employed Muslim craftsmen to build and decorate Christian buildings. This created a distinctive style called Mudéjar architecture, where Muslim artisans working for Christian patrons blended both traditions. The exchange went beyond buildings. Arabic manuscripts in translation centers like Toledo introduced Christian Europe to ancient Greek philosophy and science that had been lost in the West. Works by Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Euclid came to medieval Europeans through Arabic translations, often made by Christian scholars in Spain who knew both languages. The translation movement in Toledo in the 12th century was particularly important. Christian scholars worked with Arabic-speaking Jews and mozarabs to translate texts from Arabic to Latin. These translations transformed European intellectual life, providing the foundation for the later Renaissance. Agricultural knowledge flowed across boundaries, too. The sophisticated irrigation systems developed in Al-Andalus were adopted by Christian kingdoms. The Noria, a water wheel for irrigation, spread throughout Iberia regardless of who controlled the territory. Farmers cared about crops, not creeds. New crops transformed Christian agriculture. By the 11th century, Christian farmers in Leon and Castile were growing crops introduced by Muslims: hard wheat for pasta, rice, citrus fruits, apricots. These weren't just exotic luxuries, they were practical additions that increased food production and dietary variety. Scientific knowledge crossed borders, too. Muslim physicians were renowned throughout Europe, and Christian rulers often employed them. When Alfonso VI conquered Toledo, he specifically retained the services of Muslim doctors. Medical knowledge was too valuable to reject for religious reasons. The astrolabe, an astronomical instrument perfected by Muslim scientists, was adopted by Christian navigators. This single technology would later enable the age of exploration. The astrolabes used by Columbus's navigators were based on Islamic designs, improved through centuries of Muslim astronomical research. Even in warfare, there was technological exchange. Muslims introduced new cavalry tactics that Christian knights adopted. Christians developed new siege weapons that Muslims studied and copied. Military innovation doesn't respect religious boundaries. Perhaps most significantly, there was linguistic exchange. Arabic loanwords flooded into Spanish and Portuguese. Words like algebra, algorithm, alcohol, cotton, sugar, orange, and admiral all come from Arabic. These weren't just borrowed words. They represented concepts and technologies that came with the words. In Al-Andalus itself, a unique culture emerged that was neither purely Islamic nor purely Christian, but distinctly Iberian. Cordoban poets wrote in Arabic using metaphors from Spanish. Landscapes. Christian mozarabs wrote hymns in Arabic using Islamic poetic forms. Jewish scholars in Muslim cities translated Greek philosophy into Arabic and Hebrew. This cultural mixing created one of the most intellectually vibrant societies in medieval Europe, and it was possible precisely because the rigid us versus them narrative didn't define daily life. The irony is profound. The period we call the Reconquista, which is remembered as a centuries-long holy war, was actually a period of extraordinary cultural exchange. The very time when Christians and Muslims were supposedly locked in existential conflict was when they learned the most from each other. So here's what we've learned. The Reconquista, as it's traditionally told, is largely a myth. Not that the wars didn't happen, they did. Not that religion didn't matter, it did. But the idea of 7 centuries of relentless holy war is a narrative constructed after the fact, particularly during the later Middle Ages and early modern period when both Christian and Muslim rulers found it useful to emphasize religious conflict. The reality was messier, more interesting, and more human. Medieval Iberians of all faiths were pragmatic. They fought when fighting served their interests. They made peace when peace served their interests. They traded, borrowed ideas, married across religious lines, and formed alliances based on political calculations rather than religious dogma. The mozarabs thrived under Muslim rule for centuries, maintaining their Christian identity while fully participating in Arabic Islamic culture. The muladis converted in large numbers, not primarily through force, but through a combination of sincere conviction and practical advantage. Christian and Muslim rulers paid and received tribute from each other in complex, shifting arrangements that prioritized stability over conquest. And perhaps most importantly, the cultural exchange during this period laid the groundwork for the European Renaissance. The knowledge that transformed late medieval Europe, Greek philosophy, Islamic science, new agricultural techniques, architectural innovations, much of it came through Iberia, transmitted across the supposedly impermeable barrier between Christianity and Islam. The real story of medieval Iberia isn't about unchanging enmity. It's about how people with different faiths found ways to coexist, cooperate, and create something remarkable together. Yes, there were wars. Yes, there was genuine religious conflict. But there were also centuries of trade, diplomacy, cultural exchange, and simple daily life where Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived as neighbors. The later phase of the Reconquista, from the 11th century onward, did become more ideologically driven, more crusade-like. But even then, the patterns of coexistence persisted in many areas until the very end. Why does this matter today? Because it challenges a persistent myth that Christians and Muslims are somehow destined to be eternal enemies. Medieval Iberia proves that's not true. For centuries, these communities found ways to live together, fight together, and build together. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't always peaceful. But it worked better than we've been led to believe. History is always more complicated than the stories we tell about it, and the most interesting parts are often the ones that don't fit the narrative. And that was the story of the Reconquista that isn't usually told. The story between the battles. The story of how life actually worked when the swords were sheathed. If you made it this far, thanks for sticking around. Seriously. These deep dives into historical nuance take work, and knowing there are people willing to listen to the complicated version makes it worth it. If you enjoyed this, subscribe to the channel. There's a new video every week exploring the parts of history that get left out of the textbooks. Next video, we'll look at another myth that needs examining: the Viking raids. Were the Vikings really just bloodthirsty raiders? Or is that another oversimplification? Spoiler, it's complicated. Leave in the comments. Did anything in this video surprise you? What other historical conflicts do you think might be more complicated than we're told? Until next time.